unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Nick Bloom, who is a professor of economics at Stanford, also at the GSB. And I think you run a bunch of centers, right? One on volatility and one on...
Yeah, centers would be an over-exaggeration. But yeah, I'm involved in research on work from home, weirdly enough, volatility management. Yes.
Yeah. Well, I want to start with a discussion of productivity, because you did a lot of work in the area of productivity. And there's been a big debate about whether or not productivity is going up or going down. People talk about the great stagnation and so forth. And when you look at the kind of economic science behind productivity, right, trying to figure out where total factor productivity comes from and where this technological advancement comes from, we often don't think about management, right, as a technology. We don't think of it as a science. But it's clear that improvements in management have had a huge impact on productivity. And we see variations in management quality, both across geographies and across time periods. And so, I'm really curious about, first of all, how does one measure a management quality? And then the big mystery is, well, why doesn't it flow, right, as quickly as, say, technology? And I like to tell people when they come to Silicon Valley for these, immersion tours, I'm like, look, ChatGPT, when it's released, you're going to be able to access it in New Guinea, but when, good management technology is devised, it takes a lot longer to spread. So I guess first question is, right, why don't we think of management as a technology?
It's a good question. I think management is a huge driver of variation in productivity. In fact, if I step back and give you a huge big sweep of history, if you look at productivity growth in Northern Europe, US, to the extent you go back that far, it was really very low, close to zero, up until about 1800. So, if you look at, we have better data in the UK actually, but you look at folks in England in 1700, they weren't a lot richer than people, 1,000 years ago, a bit, but, the growth rate was pitiful, it was less than 0.1%. You then see it starts to take off with the Industrial Revolution, and productivity growth that increases, and it kind of peaks in the 50s. And then ever since the 50s, 60s, it's been slowing down a bit. So in the 50s and 60s, productivity was growing about 2%, maybe from 2.5%, 3% a year. We're now down to 1%. So that seems low compared to the 50s, but it's fantastic compared to the big history of mankind or personkind. And how much has management played a role? I think management's hugely important. So in two ways. One is just managing innovation. So if you look at universities like 300 years ago, they were focused on clerical studies and, divining the inspiration of God or classics or something, whereas at some point about 100 years ago in the US, small places like MIT, Stanford, Harvard started to get focused on research and progressing knowledge and being more scientific. The other factor of management is, think of Frederick Winslow Taylor. So he had the book Scientific Management, which is 1913. So we've had about 100 years of this, business schools. I don't know the exact date, but I believe it's either Tuck or Wharton was one.
Wharton's first.
Yeah. Was that like
1882 maybe?
Yeah, it was just over, it's about 120 years ago. Stanford GSB, where we're both sitting now, I think is about 100 years old. I should know that, I should know the exact numbers. So management has got better and better. It's part of what's driving improved productivity. So if you think of big innovations, it will be things like post-World War II, the Americans got much better at performance reviews. Think of Toyota's, from Japan, the lean production, think of mass production from Ford in the 30s and 40s. These things have come through in waves. Interestingly enough, I got interested in this in the early 2000s. So I worked in, McKinsey, for better or worse, the consulting firm, for 2 years in the early 2000s in London.
Well, I mean, that is a vector for the transmission of new managerial knowledge, right?
Totally.
These consulting firms.
Yeah, I worked in a few projects, and some you could be very skeptical of. Some were hugely massive value added. So, for example, I was working a lot in retail, and it's just incredible in retail. If you, in the UK when I was working, you walk into like Tesco, which back then, or Marks and Spencer in the UK, best in class, or think of Walmart in the US. They are so sophisticated in ways that you don't really notice as a customer. For example, this is 20 years ago now, they'd have above the checkout lines, there's cameras. And if they see there's more than 3 or 4 people, they're called folks in. The back office, the stock room was an exact mirror image of the floor, so that when you load stuff onto the restocking trolleys, you take it off in reverse order, of course, in the store. So there was all kinds of very sophisticated things. But then on the other hand, you'd have these very unsophisticated, what in England is called corner shops, that have no proper inventory control. They have way too many products. So I saw it all the time, and you're exactly right. A lot of modern management, consulting, private equity, a lot of this industry is around taking best practices and diffusing it out.
Well, you talk about managing technology, managing innovation, but setting that aside, right? Sometimes we think of that as strategic. If you look at just sort of the rudimentary, you boil it down to these 3 factors in your studies, right? Where you do these surveys, you ask these managers to describe, what they're doing. I mean, it's very qualitative. You come up with we don't have a good, solid, objective metric for good management. We oftentimes confuse the output with the input, right? You say, oh, they're making money, there must be good management, right? So how do we measure in your empirical studies, what constitutes good management?
You're exactly right. So I'm going to reverse you on your on the question. You say, well, it's funny in sport. I follow a lot of I follow Premier League. I won't mention my team, but I follow one team closely.
Don't want to make any enemies here.
No, exactly. So you notice it's what in England we call the man in the pub shouting at the TV, complaining the manager's an idiot, and it's all based on outcomes.
Yeah.
Whereas, often in a lot of athletics where you can very clearly see management, people do infer on outcomes. You're right. We had a research project that's now in its kind of 20th year, and we have a number of papers coming out. In fact, we have something about to hopefully come out in the Proceedings International Academy of Sciences on this, whereby we try and get big data. And so we've collected probably about 500,000 data points per now. And what we do, just to answer your question, is you quantitatively try to assess firms on 2 dimensions. There are others, they're just harder to measure. So the 2 that we focus on in particular are monitoring.
Yeah.
So do you collect information? Do you use it for continuous improvement? Are people aware? So at one extreme, I visited factories in, poor developing countries where there's no data, none of the employees have any ideas.
So in the Gartner hierarchy of analytics, we call that descriptive, right? Just how many employees do you have? How much output do you have, right? What does this person do? That sort of thing, right?
Yeah, exactly. So if you walk around, say, a Toyota factory, I visited a bunch of these, or Denso, there's a lot of best-in-class retailers. There's actually some very good healthcare systems. There's a range of industries. What you'll see is boards at various places all over the facilities showing performance by hour, by person. In the back office, there's a lot of information. There are targets. People are very aware. Those targets are maybe assessed weekly, monthly. So there's a whole bunch of stuff around monitoring, which some people kind of call big data, and they're overlapping, but they're not the same because some of this is pretty low tech. And then the second half is around what I call incentives. So what happens to a good employee? So does a good employee get a reward? Are they more likely to get promoted rapidly? And particularly telling me what happens to an underperforming employee. So the scale goes from kind of best would be they get identified quickly, which in itself is important. They get retrained, provided help. If after persistent retraining you can't fix them, you move them or maybe exit them out of the organization. To very badly managed organizations will leave underperforming employees in place for years. So I worked in the public sector. In a country, I won't name who, and there was certainly one extremely underperforming employee on one of the teams I was in, and they were there for a while, and eventually they left, and I asked what happened, and they said, my manager is also their manager, said, oh yeah, I gave them a fantastic performance review because I managed to kick them out and another team has hired them. I was like, no, this is, so the 2 big things for us are monitoring and incentives.
Well, the question we as economists have is how can bad management persist in equilibrium? When I was in business school, everyone I knew before tech, right? Everyone I knew wanted to go find some mismanaged ball bearing plant in Ohio, that had some 80-year-old CEO, family-owned business, take it over, apply some of the stuff you learned in the first year of MBA, right? Working capital management and so forth, double its value and sell it. Basically, this was at the beginning of private equity. So one would think that these opportunities wouldn't exist anymore, right? That every company would be run well, otherwise it would be put out of business. So how is it that we can have so much heterogeneity in terms of management quality?
It's a great question. You're right. there's a long debate actually in economics between, Stigler and a whole group of people over X inefficiency and the existence of X inefficiency, et cetera. So I'll give you 2 or 3 examples where you see it. So one example would be family firms. Where I mean family firms, I have in mind second, third generation. So this is classic story of generation 1's fantastic, really bright, maybe starts from nothing, builds up a company. Generation 2 is not that bad, continues to develop it. But they keep handing it down, in the worst case, to the oldest son, which, sounds terrible, but it's more common than you think. And generation 3, say, just isn't up to it. And the quote, Warren Buffett had this quote about imagine picking the next U.S. Olympic team as the eldest sons and daughters of the last one. You do well, but you're not going to probably win anything. And so that's factor one. Why aren't they driven out of business? The reason they're not driven out of business is they might be making economic negative value added, but they're generating cash flow. So imagine you take let's say a factory, you have no debt, you own all the land, you own all the buildings, you own all the equipment. You can make, 20 million a year of cash flow. But if a well-managed private equity firm was to take it over, they could boost it up to 100 million. But you don't want to sell because it's the family. So one of the things is family business. Another is there's quite a lot of local monopolies. Some of them are not deliberately. I remember interviewing a US firm that made massive partition walls, and they're not very mobile. And they said they're the only, it was in the Midwest, they're the only, manufacturer for 200 miles around. And so they just didn't face much competition. You see that much more in developing countries. So I've done a lot of work in, India, for example, very high tariff barriers in certain sectors. So domestically, they're not well managed. Government ownership. You also see government ownership. So there are regulation is another thing. So there are a set of factors that constrain it. On average, better managed firms expand and do well and grow, and badly ones do managed firms shrink. But this, evolutionary process takes longer than you'd think.
Right. And so if competition is intense and the companies have the ability to scale, then one would expect that bad management would be driven out. But if a company's making money and it's surviving, it doesn't really have any pressure. Why is that? I mean, we like to say in business school, at our good business schools, if it ain't broke, fix it anyway. But oftentimes when you give a case to a MBA student and the company's making money, they're like, well, the company's making money, like, why tamper with it? Do people generally think about improvements only kind of when they're under the gun? I mean, I sometimes say to corporate clients, people don't change when they see the light. They change when they feel the heat.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. You see, it's interesting. I teach that there's a case from Harvard Business School on Danaher.
Yeah.
Danaher, they are, many listeners probably know them. They're not private equity. They're an unusual beast now. They're a conglomerate. And they buy a lot of companies, hold them for, say, 5-10 years, turn them around, improve their performance, and sometimes spin them off. And they're, in some ways, you can think of them as a kind of long-term private equity company. They basically say, we try and avoid buying companies in very competitive markets because typically it's hard to find much upside. You can. So they look for, fragmented markets with lots of family ownership, less competition, more trade barriers. These companies may be making money, but they can make a lot more money if they're extremely well managed. And so, yes, the wave of private equity going back for 30, 40, 50 years has been about taking best practices and applying it. Interestingly, the US tends to, and North America in general tends to have pretty well managed companies. In our cross-country work, the US normally stacks top, particularly manufacturing, retail. These are sectors, take US manufacturing, employment is not doing well, but it's a very intensely competitive industry. Where you tend to see lower hanging fruit, take a company like Indonesia, a country like Indonesia. So you may find some firms are profitable, they're not well run because labor costs are so low and they're tariffed. And this, in some ways, is the frontier of private equity, is going into middle, lower income countries, buying up moderately well-managed family businesses and improving them to frontier management.
Yeah. Now, of course, there are ways that these ideas can get transmitted. One is through consulting, right? One is through, recruiting better managers. And then one is through acquisition or integration. I found one interesting observation in your cross-country work was that multinationals generally do better, right? Now, is that because that is the most efficient way to transmit this know-how through integration, through ownership, where you can actually tell the managers, "Yo, do this," right? McKinsey can't say, "I'm going to fire you if you don't do this," right? Is ownership kind of the best way to get information and expertise and knowledge from one place to another?
Yeah, so I mean, if I give you examples, think of Procter and Gamble, Unilever, Tata, very successful global multinationals. If you're a manager in Tata, you've probably been trained with, fantastic management practices. You're moved Indian. They bought Jaguar in the UK. I think they also bought Tetley Tea. I remember interviewing actually a Procter and Gamble factory I believe it was in Egypt, and the manager there was the manager was from some third country. I think they're from Albania or something. It was a classic story of, they'd been trained up in Holland, and the manager become very well managed, had been sent to kind of turn around this Egyptian factory and doing a very good job. So if you think about it, you're going to get people that rotate through these organizations, that get trained. Maybe their first job is in the US, and then they move abroad and take good practices with them. I should be clear, you can hear my accent's British. Britain is not at the top of this. Britain looks reasonably good on these management rankings, but it's definitely not top. I've done a lot of work using UK data. We find in general, big multinationals in the UK are better managed than domestic firms. So French, German, Swedish, Swiss multinationals, Indian multinationals. So this is a pretty universal result that multinationals tend to be well managed pretty much wherever they locate.
Well, I think there was one sector where UK was on the top. Was that education? Right? You did.
We healthcare is reasonably good. It's partly because, if you look at US healthcare, there's so many issues. There are some organizations, people invoke things like the Mayo Clinic or the Cleveland Clinic. That very, very typically well managed, but there's a lot of issues in U.S. healthcare, and so the gap to the top is a lot bigger. So the UK is the National Health Service. So I don't want to get too deep into it. My dad and sisters work there, but by global standards, healthcare is not as well managed typically as something like manufacturing or retail. But, the UK looks relatively good on that.
Well, I think you said that when the government owns it, it's generally, less well managed. And it's not because of lack of profit motive, because there are a lot of nonprofits that are quite well managed, right?
Yeah, you find in the data, on average, government-owned organizations tend not to be very well managed. And where they're particularly poor at is what I'll call dealing with underperformers. So if you look on our data, government organizations can be reasonably good at collecting data, having targets, and they're okay, but not great on incentives. If you perform well, they're just terrible at dealing with underperformers. And it's partly just politically, it's painful for politicians. Partly they're heavily unionized. Yeah. Partly there's typically also a reason why a government owns a firm. So in Europe and the US, they generally own organizations because, they want to provide public service or they want to change what they're doing or subsidize them or keep jobs in low-income areas. And that tends to conflict with often it tends to make it harder to have great management practices.
Now, you've done a lot of sort of observational studies tracking outcome variables like productivity with these input variables like monitoring and so forth. But we haven't done a whole lot of RCTs in the world of management. But you co-authored a piece, you helped run an experiment along with John Roberts, and I talked to him about this in an earlier podcast, where you gave access to world-class consulting right, to a group of firms in a random way, and you got really good results. Now, since it was free, I mean, were you able to back out the ROI if they had paid market rates for this consulting? Presumably, it would have been a positive NPV investment, right, for these firms?
Yes. So why don't I tell you the background and tell you the numbers? So a big consortium of us, Stanford, Berkeley, the World Bank, raised a chunk of money from various research organizations and actually paid Accenture in India, who worked with us on it as well, to do randomized consulting. So it sounds a bit odd, but we recruited...
well, I mean, we use it in every other area of science.
Yeah, exactly.
Why not? Right?
Exactly right. So we wanted to be scientific about this. So we recruited, dozens of medium-sized textile firms in India, in Mumbai. We tried to keep it simple, one industry, one region, one size bracket. And then we randomized. We literally flipped coins in a room in Stanford. And heads, you got treated with consulting, and tails, you didn't. And then we just tracked these guys, various measures, the practices they adopted, performance, profit, expansion, all kinds of things. What you find in summary is they adopted about half of what Accenture wanted them to. So there's a big question as why they didn't do the other stuff. And, this comes back to some of the obstacles and people didn't believe it, etc. But more importantly, the productivity, profitability, growth rates all improved a lot. What were the kind of things they were doing? One of the most impactful things was a quality control process. So what you find in these factories is they make textiles. So they make fabric, reams of fabric. Fabric ream would come off at the end of the line and there'd be grease stains on it. And so you'd be like, well, why are the grease stains? And they didn't have a good sense of it. They didn't have a very detailed quality, what was called a quality defects index. So Accenture would put this thing in and say, each day we're going to measure quality, we're going to have various defects, and we're going to review it. And it turns out, for example, of grease stains, it can come from three places. Either somebody not wearing gloves and they handle the fabric, or from a machine breaking down and leaking grease, or from somebody's overfilled the ducts. And if it's one person across four machines, one machine or all machines, it kind of gives you, you can figure it out from the data. And then you stop it and you make sure it doesn't happen again. So
the Toyota method.
Yeah, exactly. It's not rocket science.
Yeah.
And so when you explain it to people, they're like, well, why wouldn't you do it earlier?
Right, yeah.
And much as, this through time immemorial, things that are obvious after the event aren't obvious before. It's funny, I was in London over the summer. My mum was showing me her grandfather. So my great-great-grandfather set up an engineering firm that went bankrupt in World War I. And my granddad said that was quite an achievement to go bankrupt in the middle of a war. And apparently, when I was talking, they just didn't have these this were not the type of practices they used 100 years ago. Just no one had thought about this, measuring stuff, having feedback systems. And some of the Indian firms had parts of this, some of it didn't. Accenture brought them all up to a high level, and it was highly profitable. In terms of your ROI question, if they paid for consulting at the market rate, we reckon they would have paid it back in about 6 months. A follow-on question is why then they didn't all go out and pay for consulting. Part of the issue is you're in a sector where cash kind of leaks out of the business. There are a lot of people that were targeting these owners. There's like relatives, there's tax authorities, there's unions, there's suppliers. There's many other claimants to that money. So while, profits may have paid back in 6 months, how much profits actually went to the pocket of the owner is much less obvious because other people come after that. For example, the tax authorities would take a big chunk of this. So, even so, I'd have thought it was a good investment, but some of them were using Accenture. Actually, one of the telltale signs of it being valuable to the firms is we monitored how much consulting they paid for out of their own pocket. And one of the outcomes of the intervention was firms that got treated with consulting were much more likely to go on and pay for other consulting later on.
Yeah.
So they saw it as like, this is a good deal. They didn't precisely pay for what we did, but they paid for like marketing consulting and design consulting, just different things.
Well, look, there's this idea in labor economics that, you just keep hiring an input until the marginal return, goes down to the marginal cost. But it seems like with respect to quality management, the marginal benefit of incremental managerial input is positive in a lot of these places, right?
Yes. So the one top line challenge is not obvious to owners that's the case. So a completely different topic I work on is working from home. And working from home turns out, we know, and sitting in 2024, it's clearly a good idea to allow some hybrid in many organizations. It doesn't seem to affect productivity that much if you let people work from home, say 1 or 2 days a week. They're much happier, their quit rates drop, and it's highly profitable. Nobody did that really in 2019. So like the entire business world in the US, all these public listed companies were collectively making a mistake. Now, it really wasn't obvious. I wasn't, no one figured this out.
Well, you did an RCT on this.
Yeah, but even I did an RCT in 2010, but I was looking at call centers. So call centers were kind of, I don't want to be, I'm definitely not an academic saying like everyone's making mistakes. I and everyone else did not know this in 2019 in the US with this billions of dollars in consulting. So it's not that surprising if you go to middle income countries or look back in Europe 20, 30 years ago, these practices are not commonly adopted. And so part of the problem why management isn't great is owners don't appreciate it, aren't aware of it. The other part of it is it's an intangible, so it's hard to buy it. So you have 10 candidates, they all claim they're great managers. How do you know? It's a tough thing to actually turn, or 10 consulting firms. Every consulting firm claims it will make you so much money. Whether they do after the event is much less obvious.
Well, I think when you did that original research, you were focused primarily on what was called family-friendly policies, right? I think that was the term used at the time to kind of allow people the ability to have some flexibility in their work schedule. And you said that the obstacle there was primarily around perception, or you said that there are the 4 shuns. I forget what the 4 shuns are. I was like, this is cool, but awareness is a big issue. Do we still allow, I guess, irrational beliefs or beliefs that are not grounded in any kind of research to persist in our everyday operating system of business? I mean, when we think about you go to the doctor and you get some medication or you get some kind of treatment, most of that treatment has some kind of research support, right? In fact, you're not allowed to advise someone to take a pill unless it's been through FDA approval. But we have all sorts of managerial practices that we utilize that have never been backed up by any kind of RCT. Do you expect that we're going to start running all of these protocols through some kind of systemic testing? And if so, who's going to do that? I mean, is it going to be the universities that are going to do this? Is it going to be the companies themselves? I mean, I know you were just talking about Laszlo Bock and how, at companies like Google, they implement RCTs in a bunch of different ways. Is that a growth area, do you think?
Certainly it's a growth area for A/B, it's often called A/B testing in tech. But
that's usually in like marketing. Right?
Exactly right.
We find it much more difficult to do in the workplace.
You're exactly, that's what I was going to say. So it's funny, I'm 51, I've been an economist now, I guess, for 30 years or 25 years. And when I first started, A/B testing randomized controlled trials in firms was incredibly rare. It didn't really happen. Esther Duflo and a bunch of other folks, and what's called JPAL, pushed RCTs and all kinds of things like bed nets to prevent malaria and deworming pills and, training for government bureaucrats. And as part of that big increase in randomized control trials, management and economics got pulled in. So this is why I got into the zeitgeist of doing RCTs. You are right. It's relatively rare in firms. It would be ideal to have more of it. If I think of a topic that I know well, which is working from home, even now there's enormous debate. We have Elon Musk on one end, totally against it, thinks it's terrible, a highly successful, amazingly successful business. On the other hand, we know that 70% of S&P 1500 companies are allowing hybrid for professionals and managers. So most people, most CEOs, some CEOs are massively in favor of it. So GitHub has been fully remote. There's just an enormous range of views. And you might think, why doesn't someone go out and test it? Partly the world is complicated and multidimensional. So for example, for call centers, it's superb. Yeah. But if you're kind of training new lawyers, you probably want them to be in 4 days a week. And if you're serving hamburgers, you've got to do it every day. And partly there isn't much science. And, you can see the shift in work from home that went from 2019 to 2020 was an accident, came out of the pandemic, but it's permanently stuck. So yes, as you're, I'm totally aligned. The more research we have and the more randomized control trials and management will be great. Laszlo told me in his company, he was doing randomized control trials often for clients, but couldn't publish them.
Yeah,
and,
right.
It was fascinating. He was actually talking to me about, I'm not going to breach confidentiality, but, an example of where they were doing randomized control trials and work from home. Found basically that if you let people work from home 1 day a week, let's say Friday, they're so much happier. Your quit rate goes down by 20%. Quits are really expensive. The estimate is every person that quits costs roughly half their annual salary to replace them. That's the Society of Human Resource Management, because you've got to recruit them, interview them, train them up, get them up to speed. If letting them work from home on Friday reduces their quit rates by 10, 20%, but doesn't have any effect on performance, it's a no-brainer. And he said they found that in internal studies for some clients, but it wasn't in the public domain.
Yeah, so I guess it's important to understand what is the DV, right? So is it attrition? Is it workplace satisfaction? Is it, productivity? And a lot of those things, you really can only track them in the short run, right? So I think part of the pushback on the work from home movement is, well, okay, you get this wonderful productivity improvement potentially for people who already understand their job. But what about when the job is constantly changing and so forth? Do we have any good evidence on the long-term consequences of non-coordination around location?
Great. So I don't know how long-term you tell the long-term. I'll tell you at least one study I know because I've been involved in it. And it's, in fact, has a very Stanford GSB connection since... All of the co-authors have a Stanford, and 2 of the 3 are Stanford GSB connection. So we just published something in June of 2024 in Nature, which is a large randomized controlled trial on work from home. So what we did is we worked with Trip.com, which is one of the big, people that in the US probably know Expedia. It's basically same valuation as Expedia. They're both on NASDAQ. Trip is more Asia focused. Expedia is more North American focused. You think of it really Expedia for kind of the other half of the world. And what we did is we took 1,600 employees who were all grads. A third were postgrads. These are people in finance, marketing, IT, accounting. And we randomized them. So if you have an odd birthday, so you're born on the 1st, 3rd, 5th of the month, you got to work from home on Wednesday, Friday. You have an even birthday, you had to come in 5 days a week. So we did this and we held that intervention for 6 months. We then collected up to 2 more years of data. So you're going up to 2 years out. So I think that's at least the medium run. And there are 2 main sets of results. The first set of results is there was just no effect on performance. So we looked at promotions, we looked at performance reviews, we looked at individual components like leadership innovation. About half of them were in coding. We looked at lines of code written, just nothing in any dimension over any time horizon. So you're looking 2 years out. You're not seeing any impact on anything. When you interview people, they said, yeah, well, what do you expect? Because coming in the office is good for, it's slightly easier to connect, it's slightly easier to mentor, to innovate. But we're wasting a lot of time commuting and it's making me more tired and I can use that time to work a bit.
I think you mentioned also the noise and
exactly, and quiet. And it turns out those 2 offsetting effects kind of net out to 0 and under a hybrid. And then on the quit rates, the second main result is quits fell by 35%, hugely significant. And employees are much happier. They like the ability to work from home 2 days a week. The firm looks at these numbers and says this is a total no-brainer. It's millions and millions of dollars increased profitability because we're not losing anything on revenue, but we're saving millions of dollars of turnover costs.
Now, there was another result in that study, I think, which is that the people who worked from home, their behavior when they were in the office was different, right?
Yeah.
The way in which they communicated, they were more likely to use digital tools, right?
Yeah, exactly. So there's all kinds of second and third round subtle effects. I don't know whether it's good or bad, but yes, you're more likely to communicate with other people using, they have a chat app. Well, we didn't know the contents, then we could just see whether you're chatting. Work from home folks are more likely to communicate electronically. I don't know whether that's good or bad. Their performance was 0. So if I want to find something out from you, Greg, do I walk over and ask you? In some senses, that's good because we get to chat and other things may come up. On the other hand, I interrupt you in the middle of something and I take 10 minutes and I drift onto talking about the Green Bay Packers or whatever. It's a net, we found no change. The other thing that was pretty fascinating was on the days that they're working from home, the Wednesday, Friday, they're working about 2 hours less. So initially you think this is terrible. They're goofing off. Turns out their total hours throughout the week is the same because they make up for it by working more on the Monday, Tuesday, Thursdays and the weekend. When you go interview them, they say, well, of course, like if I'm at home on a Wednesday, I want to go to the dentist. Well, that's the natural day to go to the dentist or play golf or go to the gym or pick my kids up from school because I have the time and I just make up for it in the evenings on the weekend. And that flexibility turns out to be really valuable. So there are all kinds of interesting, subtle twists that were happening.
Now, I interviewed Linda Grattan, and she said that there are certain things where you want to have co-location, right? And she specifically mentioned culture formation. I talked to Gene Kim and Stephen Spears, and they said that when there is a complex dynamic process where you need to have sort of continuous communication, that might be a case where you want to have kind of co-location. So are we able to, at this point, identify the type of job, type of company, type of strategic concern and determine the optimal amount of work from home?
Totally. So I'm completely on board with all of that. So if you look at large US organizations, they typically have a mix of all 3 types of behavior. So let's pick Stanford because it's our employer. I know well about that. So Stanford has roughly 20,000 employees. Sounds massive, but we have a healthcare system as well as a university. Very roughly about 10,000 coming every day. So they are, think of food service, security, janitorial. In fact, a bunch
janitorial will be tough.
To work from home. Yeah, exactly right. But these are things you have to be there. Like nurses, there's a bunch of stuff that when you look at the job, you're like, well, obviously. And then there's a second group that will be most faculty and staff that are hybrid. So I'm hybrid. Teaching is an in-person activity. Meeting with students is mostly in person. Meeting with co-authors, using Zoom works and, et cetera. And then there's a third group that is about 1,000 to 2,000 people that are fully remote. So who are they? They tend to be call centers, data entry, payroll processing, particularly once you've been in a job 1+ year. So imagine someone that's working in a call center, been there for 3 years. I've visited a lot of call centers. 3 years in, there's not a lot of training. There's not a huge amount of, creativity in the job. So if you let someone work from home, they're saving an hour a day from less commute. It's quarter. They turn out, at least in call centers, typically to be more efficient because the management call centers, you have the headsets, you know how many calls people, and you randomly audit 1%. So in big organizations now, there is no one size fits all. It depends entirely on the occupation.
But for these kinds of transitions, I mean, it seems like there's an upfront fixed cost where you have to kind of learn how to do it in this way. Did COVID kind of force everybody to incur that fixed cost? And I'm thinking both on the side of the workers who have to learn how to use these digital tools, but also on the part of the employers who had to presumably put in place more rigorous and accurate mechanisms for monitoring performance and work and so forth.
Totally. So, the two so what's, having talked to probably by this point more than 1,000 companies, I spend my world, right? I'm just going to have lunch and an event later this afternoon. I'm actually talking to some people in China this evening about work from home. The two management so what's, I'd say, one is exactly on this, which is when people are in the office, you can see what they're physically doing. So, Greg, if you're managing me, you can see, am I at my computer? When you walk by, is the screen on Excel?
Well, I had a friend who had a motion detector outside his cubicle. Someone walked by, I would switch from ESPN back to spreadsheet.
Your friend is, I don't know. There's some of them out there, it's hard. But, generally, motion detectors aside, you can have a reasonable, I'm not claiming it's perfect. And in fact, this is kind of what I would call 4 or 5 out of 10 management. It's okay. So you can run an organization management by walking around. I wouldn't say it's particularly great, but it's kind of livable. Folks said, sure, we could get away with that in 2018. And we like to do performance management, but it often didn't live up to it. When you're working remotely, you just can't do that. You can't see what somebody's on. And even if they're a hybrid worker and they're 1 day a week at home, you really can't see what they're up to. Surveillance is horrible. People loathe surveillance. And you know all about the mouse jigglers. People try and get around it. So it's very much switch to a much greater focus on performance management. Yeah. So in econ speak, rather than measure inputs, how many hours people, look at outputs or outcomes. And that was always good pre-pandemic, but it's become critical. So one massively important so what for companies, exactly as you said, is you've got to have better performance management systems. And it's a big HR issue actually to have, look at whatever your sales or your deliverables. The other thing that I briefly mentioned is for hybrid is coordination. So it sounds kind of obvious, but if you're a hybrid plan, whereby say you've got to be in the office 3 days a week, you want to make sure it's the same 3 days in your team, because the thing that sends people mad is coming in and then spending all day on Zoom because everyone else is at home. So it's like, but those two so what's have come up very strongly.
Now, more generally, when we talk about workplace satisfaction, worker-friendly environments and so forth, and work from home is one of the things that I think people like. There's a high degree of correlation between economic performance of the company and sort of the happiness and engagement of the employees. There's one guy who's got a fund. I had this guy come and speak in my classes, the Endeavor Fund, where they only would invest in the companies that were at the top of the Fortune 500 or whatever, the best companies to work, right? And that outperformed the S&P. But of course, they didn't control for beta, they didn't control for sector, all this other stuff, right? It was mostly NASDAQ firms, mostly tech firms.
Right.
So how is there some way in which the causation goes the other way, right? Where the high performing companies are the ones that have nice workplaces, right? To what extent is the causation go in both directions?
That's a great question. It's why in the very early work I did on work from home, I had a paper I did on work from home in the early 2000s. This is data we collected in 2004, now 20 years ago. And what we found there is we collected management data. We kind of work from home and be job sharing, part-time maternity leave type data, and profits and productivity. And you find all three were positively correlated. So profitable firms that were growing fast had better management practices under our metrics and also treated employees better. And we were like, what's causing what? We really don't know. It could be one great manager puts them all in, or it could be you're profitable and you decide to treat your employees well, or treating employees well makes them, loyal and more motivated and they, perform better. I think the best evidence, it comes back to the randomized control trials. So for example, the one I was involved in China, we saw that allowing people to work from home 2 days a week had no causal effect on any performance metrics at all, but reduced quit rates by a third. And if you just go directly to the profit impact. Each quit, they reckon, cost them $30,000. So there you can say, well, look, it's being nice to people that it's improving productivity, is improving profitability.
Now, like any kind of improvement in management or in performance, it's going to require some kind of an investment. Sometimes it's investing in a new technology, right? Sometimes it's investing in new people. You've done a lot of work on the relationship between uncertainty and investment,
right,
and leaning on real option theory. So, in a world where there's a lot of uncertainty, it pays to kind of wait and see and wait until that uncertainty is resolved before you make the investment. But it also provides a reason for making certain types of investments, right? Exploratory investments. What do we know? Because we are living in a world where it seems like uncertainty is just getting greater and greater as things change.
Yeah, so on the first point, we have various metrics, this thing called the Economic Policy Uncertainty Index, which Bloomberg and Reuters and people carry in it. You're right that if you go back for 30 years, uncertainty seems to be rising in North America, Northern Europe. Part of it's the political situation, part of it's globalization, part of it's just we've been somewhat more unfortunate.
Well, so hold on. How do we measure that? I mean, some people will point to the VIX, but that seems like only, right? That's a subset of what you're
the
talking
VIX,
about, right?
So I know how everyone knows this, but the VIX is effectively it's volatility in the S&P 500, effectively what it is. And that has been relatively flat. It goes up and down at high frequency, but if you look back, the data goes back to 1990. And it's been pretty flat. S&P 500 volatility, you can map that back to like 1880, and it was massively high in the Great Depression, actually. If you go back in 29 to 33, it's off the scale, and it moves up and down. But that isn't trended. Our measures, the downside of that is it's only public listed companies, and it's affected by leverage and tax regulations, all kinds of other stuff. So I'm not against it. I use the VIX in my PhD, actually, but the measure I'm talking about, there's two different measures I was kind of converged together. One is scraping newspapers, and it's just the frequency of articles that talk about uncertainty around, the economy. The other is the Economist.
And so that doesn't necessarily track any kind of ground truth, but we don't really care about the ground truth, right? We care about beliefs.
Yeah, so that's a deep question as to, turns out that measure, by the way, is highly correlated to the VIX. So if something crazy happens, like, the pandemic or 9/11, when I started working on this just around 9/11, actually, around the time I was doing my PhD, and 9/11 caused an enormous surge in stock market volatility, as you can well imagine. In fact, in the US, it was closed for a few days, but it was open in Europe, so you can use that as a proxy. And the VIX went to at that point, all-time highs. Our EPU measure, Economic Policy Uncertainty in newspapers, of course, also surged to the roof, because early on, nobody even knew. Bin Laden didn't initially come forward. I don't know if you remember this, the anthrax attack. There's all kinds of related things. So they moved together. You're correct. What are newspapers picking up? We had kind of two thoughts. And one is like what I call a Geiger counter type thing. They're a kind of noisy measure of what's going on underneath. So Geiger counter, it goes bing, bing, bing. There's radiation, whether if it's going slowly, there's less. The alternative is they set the scene. So it may
because there's like a political economy of media, right? Which is the fear industrial complex that people talk about, right?
Yeah, we found a bit of that. I would say it's more a direct measure. The way we looked at the second is we looked at left versus right leaning outlets. For example, just simplest, compare, say, the Wall Street Journal with the New York Times. I read both of them every day, but the Wall Street Journal is clearly somewhat more right leaning, and the New York Times, it says, somewhat left leaning. If you look at those, you'd find under Republican administrations, it is true that the left-leaning papers would talk slightly more about policy uncertainty, and then under Democrat, the right-leaning, but the gap was very small. So mostly all of these papers right across the political spectrum would go up after 9/11, and go up in the financial crisis, went up in the pandemic, and drop back down again. So I think they're primarily measuring things. Where it gets tricky is to think about individuals like Trump. So when Donald Trump came onto the scene, the discussion of uncertainty in the newspapers went up dramatically, in part because Trump just dominated headlines. So there's just more talk about policy because Trump was such a larger than life figure. So whether policy was more uncertain is less obvious, but certainly it was, the newspapers were talking a lot more about policy and writing more articles. So that's where life gets a bit tricky.
Well, I think most people would understand that in an environment of high political risk, you're going to make less investment, or at least you're going to skew the investment in a direction that's going to somehow insulate you from the political risk. But it would seem like the political risk or the political uncertainty or policy uncertainty, that's almost it pales in comparison to technological uncertainty. when we're trying to
You're right. So I'm sorry, I didn't answer your key question early on. So there are two effects. So one effect is negative. So that's probably the thing people think first off. So there's a famous book by Dixit and Avinash Dixit and Rob Pindyke that came out in 1994. I remember I first saw that around the time I started my PhD actually. And that's all around what's called real options. So the idea is, it's very simple. Imagine you're going to, I don't know, build a new factory or open a new store or hire somebody. If you're very uncertain, you're nervous about making that costly decision because if you decide 6 months later you've made a mistake, you can't easily unwind it. So that all says high uncertainty reduces investment, reduces hiring, reduces activity. And that's really what I've focused on. And you do find lots of evidence for that in the data. And the VIX is very high. Normally investment at the aggregate level drops down in hiring. Yeah. The other angle that in some ways is a very Silicon Valley take is high uncertainty is where the money is. Yeah. When life's uncertain, that's where, the profits have been made, kind of Warren Buffett / VC is. That's also true. That's a good example of that would be the dot-com boom. So in the dot-com boom, everyone kind of knew in the early 2000s, look, the internet's going to be a big thing. And it turns out it was a big thing. You just don't know which bit and when and how. And so the view is, look, if we invest in the internet, we have a lot of these implicit options on it. And if it takes off, these are valuable. If they're not, we wasted our money, but no more. And so there's also kind of what I call exploratory investment. When demand or markets are uncertain, you do, on the other hand, want to spend some kind of R&D-ish type money or open subsidiaries or open up a website or whatever. And it's like placing a bet. It's like investment in equity if you think about it. And if it works out well, great, you 10x your money. And if it doesn't, you've lost your cash.
Well, this takes us back full circle to where we started. You came up with, I think, an ingenious way of measuring the quality of the management of a firm, of a school, of a hospital, right, of a government administrative body. But the things you were measuring, we might think of as, I don't know, old school management, right? I mean, those were things that were, I have a colleague who used to say, if you want to learn how to run a 19th century railroad, get an MBA because you're going to learn all this stuff about cost accounting and operations and so forth. But it seems like in today's world, you need sort of a different type of managerial talent, the ability to identify opportunities, to make strategic investments, right? To buy these lottery tickets, buy the right ones, and then have a process for, growing those investments upon the arrival of good information and so forth. Do we have a way yet of tracking that variable? I mean, because that'll be a sort of if you could get that as a leading indicator, right, from an investment perspective, I mean, that would be a golden ticket, right?
So on the MBA, so I had a paper, it was called, In Defense of Competent Management. And the idea was there's often a massive excitement about strategy and, trying to get an MBA to do a kind of, standard regular summer job is impossible. They want to change the world. And now, and, they haven't changed the world by lunchtime, they're depressed. Right. And so we were saying, look, let's get the basics right. Like get the basics right, proper performance reviews, proper management practice, proper feedback systems. Then after that, you can then think about, impressive strategy and advanced R&D cycles, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one answer is I think, you want the proper, it's like building a house. You want to make sure the foundations is good before you build story one. The other thing is we have this thing called the World Strategy Survey, whereby we've surveyed a number of firms on making strategy. So it's a similar idea. When they make strategy, do they have a framework? Do they think through alternatives? Do they collect data to refine it? Is it well disseminated? Is everyone on board? The kind of thing, when you looked at the grid, you think, isn't this obvious? Doesn't everyone do it? And much like our management survey, the answer is no. I mean, firms on a 1 to 5 scale, we interviewed primarily US firms, are getting about a 3. There are lots of firms, say, that have a strategy that no one in the firm seems to know, or, they've never considered alternatives, et cetera. What you find is firms with better basic management tend to have better strategy management. And those that do good on both perform dramatically better. So in some senses, it comes back to the primitives of being logical, methodical, thinking through decisions. Even I suspect, the very famous great managers of the Steve Jobs type, probably while he was, brilliant and came up with excellent ideas, underneath it probably had some kind of order behind the system.
There's an interesting item in one of your studies that showed that the closer you are to a university, the higher the likelihood that your company is run well, right? And presumably the better the school, the better it is run. We live in a world where I can get ChatGPT for $20 a month, and I more or less have access to the tools that the best companies have. Do you ever see a day where the kind of expertise that you get at a place like GSB will be available to anywhere, anyone on the planet?
Yeah, so it's hard. So you're right. If you are located near a university, on average, your management practices are better. It's less clear why. So there's at least three different versions. One is you could think of, exec ed. And by the way, this is all universities, there are thousands of them around the world. So this isn't so much Stanford. It would be like, Exton State University, or
Hey, if we could measure the ROI on our exec ed, that would be pretty nice.
We are
right?
a total outlier. Berkeley and Stanford is so one thing is it could just be better exec ed, and a lot of this is more like evening consulting, etc.
Right.
A second could be a supply of graduates. So maybe nothing to do with the business schools at all. It may just be Stanford has a very successful CS department, and these graduates tend to manage well. A third could be it turns out universities tend to be in high income areas. And partly because of the university, but if you look at a college town around the world, I know the UK, universities, Oxford, Cambridge, think of university towns, they're wealthy, and it may be to survive, you need to be well managed, So, but it's certainly true on average that firms nearer universities tend to be better managed. They also tend to be more profitable. But of course, the cost of land, this isn't a market economy, so it's more expensive to buy the land there. So it's not you can't immediately set up a firm in a university town and assume you're going to make money because it's expensive to found.
Well, Nick, thanks so much for joining me. Lots of fun stuff. We could continue the conversation, I'm sure, for a really long time, but I think we're going to have to wait until another time. So
Thanks so much. It was fantastic.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.